Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video which covers anxiety as part of the psychological health and wellbeing topic for stage 2 psychology. This video will cover the symptoms and the treatments from the biopsychosocial model of wellbeing. Let's get started. So let's first define what anxiety is. There's actually many different types of anxiety disorders. However, all of them, regardless of the actual diagnosis itself, has the experience of strong and/or frequent anxiety or fear. So no matter what the anxiety disorder is, in other words, all of them have the strong and overwhelming at times feelings of anxiety or fear. So some different anxiety disorders are listed here. Some of them I'm sure you've probably heard of. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. Phobias are classed as an anxiety disorder under the anxiety umbrella in the DSM-5, which is characterized by intense irrational fear, which inhibits day-to-day functioning of a particular stimuli. So this might include heights or spiders or crowds or getting old or dying, things of that nature. The list goes on. There's also panic disorder, which is characterized by intense panic attacks. So the flight or fight response is so high that people get into panic mode and may hyperventilate. Sometimes it's known what causes the panic attack, sometimes it's not. So that's why it's considered a panic disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is characterized by the overwhelming feeling of needing to perform what are called rituals and intrusive thoughts that if the rituals are not performed, something very bad will happen to the individual, their family, or the people around them, or society in general. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, very much characterized by significant stress after a very traumatic life event. This may be war or a car accident or abuse or the death of a loved one, certainly not limited to those, but just post-traumatic intense stress after a traumatic event that is enduring. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, characterized by just being in general very anxious day to day and having a very overactive flight or fight response, and other psychological and social factors go into that as well. So when someone says that they have anxiety, typically it is generalized anxiety disorder. Also social phobia, so being phobic of social situations and the fear or phobia of getting ridiculed or judged or criticized. So let's look at the biopsychosocial model, and starting with the biological, the factors that contribute to anxiety and the symptoms of anxiety. So the flight or fight response of someone with anxiety is much more active. So we know that the flight or fight response is there. It's an innate response to keep us safe. So it'll help us to stay and fight the threat or run away. Now, the flight or fight response is also activated for day-to-day stressors, such as a deadline or going through a stressful time at work or school or significant, distress with a loved one or things like that. Generally speaking, however, the flight or fight response will return to normal. The parasympathetic nervous system will kick in and reduce our stress response to normal levels. However, people with anxiety disorders, the flight or fight response is much more reactive and stays higher than what would be considered typical or within the normal range. So in other words, someone with anxiety has a much more active flight or fight response, characterized by a lot of these biological symptoms here, which I'll talk about in a minute. There is also some research to suggest that there are genetic markers for vulnerability to anxiety disorders, so there is evidence to support that it is genetic, so it's more likely to be passed down through families. So some biological symptoms of anxiety include headaches or migraines, trembling or shaking because of the adrenaline that's released because of the flight or fight response, intense nausea and constipation and diarrhea is also quite common, muscle tension, dizziness and lightheadedness. That makes sense because of the flight or fight response. There's an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, which then causes that very lightheaded feeling. Insomnia is very common, so the inability to fall asleep and or stay asleep if we're very, very stressed and we're very anxious. That disrupts our normal sleep-wake cycle. Genetic factors, like I said before. Heart palpitations, so that horrible skipping of the heartbeat feeling. This then can lead to chest pain and pressure. So a lot of people, if they're having an anxiety attack or a panic attack, the symptoms, as you can see here, often mimic a heart attack. So often people are administered with a suspected heart attack when it's actually, in fact, a panic attack, because a lot of the symptoms are similar. With that also increase in sweating. That makes sense with the increase in heart rate and blood pressure. There would be an increase in temperature leading to sweating, all right, and obviously muscle tension and nausea. So it is a very biologically based illness in terms of its symptoms. And tingling sensations are quite common as well, particularly in the hands and feet. That goes in line with, again, the flight or fight response being active and people having pins and needles and tingling sensations in their hands and feet. So let's look at the psychological factors and symptoms of anxiety. So anxious people often have what's called interpretation bias, where they perceive information from others as negative towards themselves, even when there's no grounds for that. So they will interpret constructive criticism or feedback to a group as only applying to them, and they will interpret it in such a way that it's very, very negative, when actually that's not the case at all. Often memory is impaired due to inattention to tasks and worrying about other aspects. So because our flight or fight response is so high, or a person's flight or fight response is so high, that can impair memory. And because they're worrying about other aspects, often memory is affected. We need to also take into account an individual's past experiences, okay, so what their personality style is, attitudes and beliefs, and stress management skills. So these are individual differences that we need to take into account as well. With that, just going back to our previous topic, people who are high in neuroticism and also can be high in conscientiousness tend to be more susceptible and vulnerable to anxiety disorders, especially generalized anxiety disorder. And women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders than men, but it's thought that that's only because women are more likely to seek help for anxiety than men because of the stigma around men and mental illness, which I talk about in another video. So the psychological symptoms of anxiety may include magnifying threats and failures, fear and worrisome thoughts most of the time, if not all the time, irrational fears, as I said before, fear of panic and public scrutiny, so tend to self-isolate as a result, very, very sensitive to criticism, worrying about potential mistakes even if they haven't happened yet, avoidance of social situations or avoidance of situations where they may be triggered, persistent unwanted thoughts, feelings of anxiety, confusion and resentfulness, and very high neuroticism, as I said before. So as we know from looking at the psychological factors, some of these are universal across all humans. So again, memory, perception, emotions, and some obviously are individual differences. We need to take all of them into account. Looking at the social factors of anxiety, anxiety disorders can develop from a traumatic event based on a person's social, socioeconomic, political, religious, or cultural affiliation. Again, examples include but are not limited to war, abuse, poverty, and the pandemic, obviously. So some other social symptoms or factors of anxiety include fast-paced lives. So we weren't really designed as human beings to live in the world that we live in now, and that can cause a huge amount of anxiety as a result and a lot of pressure. Environmental stressors, as I said before, so having a conflict in the home or conflict with relationships can contribute to anxiety. Decreased job security, lack of family support, avoidance of groups, particularly work colleagues and social groups, avoidance of social contact and crowds for fear of criticism or fear of being overwhelmed, social phobias, as I said before, and of course the difference between cultures. So certain cultures are more accepting of anxiety disorders, where others are not, depending on obviously the stigma that's involved and the awareness that are involved. So some treatments for anxiety from the biological perspective of the biopsychosocial model. So there are anti-anxiety medications. The most common type are called benzodiazepines, or benzos for short. These are a type of tranquilizer or sleeping pill, depending on the type and depending on the active ingredient. Regardless, they promote relaxation and reduce muscle tension. So they lower physiological responses and can lower the flight or fight response. So benzodiazepines are very quick acting and very fast acting. Because of that, they should only be used for a very short amount of time, as they can become highly addictive. So ideally, benzodiazepine should only be taken for a short time, no more than about 3 months. And benzos should also be used in conjunction with another treatment, not as the only treatment for anxiety. So because we're seeing a lot of issues with benzodiazepines becoming addictive and also not interacting well with other medications, leading to things like accidental overdoses, the more common medication for anxiety is now antidepressants. So some types of antidepressants are effective for anxiety, even if the client is not experiencing depressive symptoms. And as we know from my previous video, these help to correct the imbalance of chemical messages between the nerve cells and the brain. So as we talked about in class, or if we haven't already, what we will talk about in class is that antidepressant medication is definitely the more popular choice among GPs and psychologists over benzodiazepines, because there's risks involved in terms of addiction and interference with other medications with benzos, not so much for antidepressants. Antidepressants are seen as safer as a long-term option. Okay, so psychological treatments for anxiety include obviously CBT. I talked about this in a previous video. So CBT, as we know, is a structured psychological treatment which recognizes the way we think. So again, cognition and act, our behavior will affect the way that we feel. So if we challenge the anxious thoughts, it will lead to a change in our behavior, which will then lead to a change in the way we feel and perceive information. It involves a professional therapist to identify thought and behavior patterns that make someone more likely to be anxious, or what triggers them to be anxious and have panic attacks, for example, or be triggered to do certain rituals or have similar stimuli that increase their PTSD symptoms, for example. So by making the client more aware of the thoughts and behaviors, the client can start to make changes to thoughts, which will in turn improve coping skills. Again, it's one of the most common effective treatments for depression and anxiety and is used for all age groups, so women, children, young, old, and across a variety of cultures. And of course, the social treatments or social aspects for support groups and services according to the biopsychosocial model, belonging to a recognised support group for anxiety is seen to have very positive results. Recognised support group obviously coming from Headspace, Beyond Blue, Movember, Lifeline, etc. So hearing and talking to others who know what the client is going through, again, promotes feelings of belonging and not being alone, and feeling that they have someone or a group of people that understand what they're going through. Again, this can be done both in person and online. Online is gaining a lot of popularity because it's seen as the safer option and as to not trigger the symptoms of anxiety and, of course, depression, what I talked about in a previous video. So I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.